Well, hello, everybody, and welcome to Crushing Land, our special guest episode. We're happy that you're with us here today. And with us today is Tyler Sgro, a licensed soil scientist, and we'll let him talk a little bit about himself. But what we're going to talk about today is crushing septic. Now, from the land investing standpoint, we're not actually talking about putting septic tanks in and things like that, at least not for most of us. But what we're talking about is getting them ready. As vacant land investors, especially on the East Coast, one thing that comes up all the time is, has the land perked, has the land perked, has the land perked? I get a question all the time, especially in certain states. Tyler actually happens to work in a couple of those states where that's the case. What you're going to hear today is somewhat state specific, but it does apply across the entire country. He'll talk about the states that he works in and all of that, and the concepts and the ideas and the information is going to be good for you regardless of where you are. But again, if you need services and things like that in other states, you'll have to reach out to people there. But this is just something to help you to take it to the next level. As he's speaking today, I'll throw in some examples. He's worked with me on a couple of properties already. They've actually turned out very well for us as investors because of what was done. So we'll kind of talk about those stories and things like that as we're going along. We are monitoring the comments here. So as we're doing that, as we're going along here, we'll, if you have any questions and comments for him as he's going along, feel free to put them into the chat regardless of where you're watching, and we'll make sure to answer those at the end. So again, everybody, welcome. We'll turn it over to Tyler. We'll let him do his introduction, give you guys a little bit of a presentation. And then again, as we said at the end, feel free to ask any questions. So Tyler, thanks for joining us, and let's jump into it.
Yeah, good afternoon. Thanks for the introduction, Jonathan. So as you mentioned, I'm a licensed soil scientist in the state of North Carolina. I'm also a licensed soil classifier here in South Carolina. We're in the process of trying to get licensure in Georgia to also be able to perform perc testing, or what they refer to as tier 3 or tier 4 testing over there. So again, this is going to be very state specific to the areas of expertise that we work within, geographic regions that we're used to, but hopefully this will be applicable for other folks who are listening to kind of apply these ideas to their state specific methodology, and they can incorporate ways to maybe add value to their projects and hopefully get permits they need a little bit quicker. So with that, let me pull up our presentation here. Give me 1 second. All right, Jonathan, can you see the presentation on the screen there?
I do not.
Okay, sorry, bear with me 1 second. I'm going to share the screen here. All right, there we go.
Good. See ya.
All right, good deal. I am a millennial, but sometimes technology gets the best of me as well. So just want to kind of cover, again, overview of what we do as soil scientists or soil classifiers. The nomenclature of folks in our profession may vary depending on the state folks are in. But again, there's usually some sort of framework that's state specific to allow private sector folks to assist in the septic permitting process. So we'll cover intro kind of topics as far as it relates to soil science specifically. So that way, if you ever get a report that has all these different names or nomenclature of soil specific things, maybe have a little bit better understanding of what that would be. Again, what it is that we do, overview of septic systems specific here to South and North Carolina, as well as a quick refresher on regulations in each of those states, different types of septic systems that may be applicable, and we can obviously do Q&A at any point. So having said that, just want to touch on the basics very quickly as far as what soil is. It's not dirt. I know everyone likes to make that joke. It's just dirt. You're a dirt doctor. But there is an actual definition to soil. It's basically unconsolidated material on the Earth's surface. we're also going to be looking at different elements of soil conditions in our analysis, as far as soil color, soil texture, things that are going to influence a septic system design. Those are things that we're primarily focused with. This is just a quick overview of what a typical soil horizon would look like if you went out and dug a hole in your backyard. This is what we actually describe on most of the data sheets that we actually record for this process. So you can see surface layers, subsurface layers, they all have their different nomenclature. And oftentimes you're going to see this kind of nomenclature on a data sheet that a soil professional like myself would record. Not that it's useful from a septic design or, again, a development perspective, but that way, hopefully, when you're having conversations with soil professionals and they start throwing out all these different terms and nomenclature, it doesn't go completely overhead. That way you can kind of maybe start communicating at that level a little bit more frequently. But generally we use this horizonation nomenclature, these letters, to describe different layers in the soil profile. From there, we're also using what's called a Muncell color book. This is one of the tools that we use to actually identify the color of soil. I joke with folks all the time that I'm basically a glorified Lowe's employee. I take a piece of soil and I match it to a paint swatch. So there's specific nomenclature that we use for that color coding. So we're not calling different soil colors, sunset red or something like that you'd see at Lowe's. We actually have nomenclature we have to use, which we'll touch on here in a second. One of the main things I will say, though, that we look at that kind of goes back to that color analysis that we perform is the color is going to tell us what's going on in most cases with a water table. This may vary geographically speaking, depending on the mineralogy and chemical content of the soil. Especially here in the Southeast, we have soil conditions that are high in iron content. And what that means is if you've ever seen Piedmont soil in the Southeast, it's usually going to be yellow, orange, a lot of red clay, especially. Those colors are consistent across the geographic region. So you could be on the coastal plain, you could be, again, Appalachian Mountains. You're going to see most of these oranges to red colors across the board. The reason that is the soil is high in iron content. And so think of it as the soil is rusting because there's oxygen that cycles through the soil, and that's how we get these colors. One of the cool things that we're able to do is tell where the water table in a soil profile is going to exist by looking to see where we get changes in color from the typical reds and oranges to these grayer subsurface layers. This is something that is really driven home in a lot of the septic regulations, especially in the 2 states that we are currently operating in. Looking for these gray colors is kind of one of the more important aspects of our role, because that again is going to tell us where the water table is fluctuating in a given year. So another thing that we often get asked is, well, it just rained yesterday. Why are you out there doing a perc test? Because that's what most people still refer to it as. So there's a couple things to break down with that. The first being that for the most part, especially in the Southeast at least, we don't actually do what most folks refer to as perc tests. So as a refresher, a perc test is where you dig a hole, you pour water, set volume of water into the hole, and you see how quickly the water will drain through the soil or percolate through the soil. Most states moved away from that model of testing, mainly for the reason being that it's highly subjective to climatic events. So if you have really wet conditions, even if you have a well-drained soil, it's going to drain water quickly, you may get a false negative test. Conversely, if you have a site that drains really quickly, it's high in sand, for example, but it's a lower lying property and you go out there in really dry conditions, you may get a false positive where the county or regulatory authority issues you a permit, says, yeah, this is good, but you go back to that same site in wetter conditions and it's not going to drain because there's standing water everywhere. So most of the states, again, at least in the Southeast, moved away from that model of testing years ago. And instead, we look at these long-term hydraulic or hydrologic indicators of soil wetness to tell us where typical water tables are going to be in the profile. So it's a much more accurate way of testing. But again, I don't think the terminology of soil testing or soil classification for septic is quite as catchy as perc testing. So unfortunately, that's what most folks still refer to it as is perc testing. I think a lot of the public still thinks we do actual perc testing, but again, across the board, not very common. And so you can see here in this example, just differences in soil colors I was referencing. So the picture on the left, much better drained soil condition, high in iron content, not really seeing much gray soil color through that profile. Picture on the right, you kind of see what's going on there. Dark surface, gray subsurface, very indicative of wetter conditions. And the soil testing here was done under a wetter period of time. And you can see that by the water sitting in the soil pit. So what is a soil classifier, as we refer to them here in South Carolina, soil scientist in North Carolina? Essentially, the easiest way to describe it is someone who has a strong educational and experiential background in soil science. Every state's going to be different in how they approach their private sector licensure programs. Here in South Carolina, at least, it's someone who's trained under a licensed professional for a set period of time, has passed certain levels of examination to determine their level of knowledge in soil science. And you have to have a certain educational background in that. So we definitely want, qualified people who understand soil dynamics, soil property, etc., to be doing this work. It's very easy to have people who go out there in other states where this is not, as heavily regulated, do this work and kind of run into issues because soil can change on a single property. It can change within a 10 by 10 radius. So having that knowledge and expertise is really important to ensure quality systems are essentially being constructed. Mainly what we do, at least here in the two states we work in, we help expedite timeframes for review from the local regulatory authorities. Here in South Carolina, that regulatory body is going to be the Department of Health and Environmental Control. That is a state-run regulatory agency. In other states, it may be a regulatory agency at the county level, so we see that from time to time. North Carolina is like that. Most of their environmental health departments that regulate this are actually at the county level. So there are benefits and disadvantages to each approach. Personally, I prefer the statewide approach here in South Carolina. We have 12 regional offices in the state, and we get enough disagreement on how to interpret the regulations among the 12 offices. You can imagine a state like North Carolina where it's county based. There's over 100 counties in that state. And so instead of 12 different opinions, that's 100 plus different opinions. So again, benefits and disadvantages to each, but that's typically what we see across state lines. Another benefit, though, for soil classifiers and scientists is that we can usually perform preliminary site analysis for large-scale site development. So for folks who are more on the development side of things, where they're taking raw land and turning that into either large-scale residential subdivisions, maybe looking to do large acre kind of single home builds, any of those things, it can be sometimes helpful to map the preliminary soil conditions to know where you want to focus your septic systems in aggregate. And then also, again, having qualified people doing this to ensure that you're going to have system success.
Hey, just a thought on that, Tyler, real quick. Just kind of to talk a little bit about what we do.
Sure.
Just to bring it into land investing world a little bit. This was before you. I mean, you've done our last few projects for us, but the project that I did beforehand, people have heard me talk about it, where the county went out and basically looked at this large property and failed it, and basically like just picked the easiest spot and was like, that's not good.
Right.
And so it was a large property. And what we did afterwards was we hired somebody like yourself that was licensed in the state, they went out and we worked with an engineering firm and we turned that into 14 properties. It was like 17 acres, and so it went from a failure across the board to 14 passes, basically finding these different spots and looking at, like you said, they did the preliminary work, because by zoning, we actually could have got about 19 properties out of it. But because of soils, we weren't able to get 19. We were only able to get 14. But that was all part of that work that they did that you just explained. They did that classification. They looked at it. They kind of figured it out and said, no, we think we can get this. And then he went out and actually did the work. And then the engineering firm obviously broke it up, with their surveys and things like that to actually create the properties. But they did the whole project. So just a little bit difference there is kind of bringing it into our world of what he's talking about, from going from nothing, literally from the county standpoint, to having somebody do this work, do this preliminary thing, look at it, and all of a sudden now it's okay, here's 14 properties.
Exactly. And we see that all the time. It's actually one of the things I'm going to touch on here in these next couple slides. But we have found across the board, no matter South Carolina, North Carolina, whatever the state, there's a strong misunderstanding of how the septic permitting process works. And I'm not saying that's an issue to any one specific group, but usually the starting point on that is going to be the real estate community, realtors in particular. And if you're a new realtor trying to get into land, we'll see this happen quite often where they may not even know that there are private sector professionals who can not only assist with the situation that you had described, Jonathan, but also just to even expedite the process. But regardless, we see a lot of real estate contracts written up in a sense, again, using old terminology of will this site perk or not, contingent on a perk test. A lot of these real estate phrases that are put in actual contracts are primarily outdated, at least in the two states we work in. So South Carolina especially, we have to kind of coach sometimes folks going through this process who haven't done it before, mainly because their idea of a perk test passing or failing is, can I get a permit from the county or from DHEC or the state? And in your case, they came out there, said, nope, nothing we can do here. A lot of times, kind of green real estate agents will advise their clients, oh, you don't want to purchase that property then. And really, at the end of the day, what it means is this property doesn't meet their standards to be able to get a permit, but there are alternative solutions out there depending on the circumstances where you could turn this into a successful project, and case in point with the situation you had. So we see that from time to time. That's not uncommon. It just comes down to trying to get the word out there of, more accurately how the actual process would work.
Yeah. And sometimes, you talk about this alternative thing, just to clarify that a little bit. Sometimes the alternative is the person just looked the wrong way on the property. Mm-hmm. It's like, if they had just gone, you did a property like that for me. You literally called me from the property and you were like, well, they went to the right because it was clear. And if the guy just went to the left instead, he would have found perfect soils. And that was just a conventional system. There's nothing going on there. That property is actually under contract and is going to be sold probably next week. We're closing or the week after. And nice substantial profit on that. And literally it was just like you said, you called me. I was actually out of town when you called and you were like, I don't understand what they're doing. It's like, all they had to do was go 50 feet that way instead. And they would have. So alternative sometimes isn't really alternative. It just means doing a little extra work, right? It's like, or a little, just a little difference.
Yeah, and this, this isn't in any way to demean the work that the county or state regulatory professionals, any work that they're doing. That's not that. But at the end of the day, either due to regulatory framework in their organization or agency, or due to just personnel, their own personal reasons, I guess. We do see that from time to time where there are projects where, had they looked somewhere else, the result would be drastically different. At least here in South Carolina, DHEC is instructed to only test the area that you mark on the property for them. within 150-foot radius of that point. So if you have a 10-acre site here in South Carolina, you send this to DHEC and they go out and test the exact location. That may be in bad soil conditions. And so you'll get a letter from them that says, nothing we can do here. You need to hire someone in the private sector to find a solution. When alternatively, there's maybe 2 acres out there that is suitable for septic. So that's one of the things that can happen. And then the other being, on your project specifically, yeah, there was a very obvious area where conventional systems should go. It was a heavily wooded site, so I can't really speak to what decisions were made when other professionals went out there to take a look at it. But clear as day, there was a nice little high point, and soil conditions look great there. So yeah, it can be a case where someone misses something, or due to their internal processes, they're not allowed to look at other areas. But having said that, we'll kind of look here at a quick example of how that plays out. Just in a general sense, if you were to hire a private sector professional like myself versus going to the county or state, because there also are time benefits here to keep in mind. So this would be case in point, where if you as the potential applicant trying to get a septic permit don't want to hire a person, you say, oh, they're too expensive, or let me try my luck with the county or state first. That's the way I've always done it. Most of the county or state offices, depending on where you are going to be anywhere from potentially 4 to even 12 weeks out to even be able to get out to the property to do an initial test. So best case is you wait 4 to 12 weeks, they come out, you have good soil conditions, then they go back to the office, they issue you a permit. So the only loss on your end is you've waited all that time to get your permit. Worst case example, again, not bringing someone in on the front end, is you wait the 4 to 12 weeks. County or state comes out there to do their test, and they say, nothing we can do here, we're going to turn this site down. So really, you've waited 4 to 12 weeks to essentially be told you're back to square one. Then at that point, you may decide, okay, well, now I need to hire a private sector professional to take a look at this. We then have to get it, contracting in place. We then have to schedule the site visit, do our on-site work, and then either send that back to the county or state for conventional style permits, or work with other licensed professionals to do more advanced type of solutions in challenging soil conditions. So here you can see where this example actually plays out in a time frame or timeline. Best case 4 to 12, you get your permit, good soil conditions. Worst case, you may be waiting 7 to 15 weeks to complete this whole process, because again, the state or county is going to take their time on the front end. And then if they don't issue your permit, then you're hiring professionals on the back end to meet whatever your time demands are going to be. You can see here also, we list where a professional engineer may be brought on this kind of case study example, depending on the state. So for example, here in South Carolina, if we run into bad soil conditions, the state requires a PE to design the system based on the work of a soil classifier like myself. So in those cases, we then get brought out to do the site work behind the state. We then confirm their findings potentially. Hey, yeah, this is bad soil. We can't do a conventional system. We then send our results to a septic engineer. You're then having to contract with them for their services too. They design the system based on our testing results. Then they get that engineered permit from the county or state. North Carolina differs a little bit in that case. North Carolina has some specific laws and legislative guidance that was issued through COVID that allows soil classifiers to sometimes design really any system out there. In addition to that, there's also what's I think referred to as the COVID submittals. That's where the soil classifier is designing the system and taking responsibility for the oversight of the install for that. From a personal standpoint and from our company's standpoint, we typically in North Carolina don't get involved in the COVID session submittals. We do, and we do, however, do what's called session law submittals. So um, I know we're kind of getting into the regulatory weeds here as far as laws and regulation are concerned. Um, so I'll briefly touch on this. We'll further explain it through future slides. But the laws, the way they're written here in South Carolina, a soil classifier like myself can be brought in on the front end or the back end, like I just described, to do soil testing. If we go out on the front end and find a conventional system area, then we send our findings to the state. They have a set mandated turnaround time. They have to turn the permits around to us, and then off they go to build or develop the property. Equally, like I described before, we also may be brought in on the back end or on the front end still, where soil conditions are poor, or if we find poor soil conditions on a front end kind of analysis. And if that's the case, then we send the results to the engineer. They design the system. So it's a fairly straightforward workflow as far as things in South Carolina. North Carolina, because their septic framework is a little more robust, there's a lot more flexibility given to the private sector licensed professionals. So in North Carolina, there are some soil scientists who only go out and do essentially preliminary opinion analysis. So that would be where you hire one of these guys, they go out there, they dig a hole or two on the property and they say, yeah, I think this will pass for this type of system. You get a piece of paper, but there's no permit or anything at the end of that process. I would say that's on the lower end of testing that you're going to see in North Carolina specifically. In between there, you have the session law submittals. That's where the North Carolina legislature allowed for soil professionals to actually design the systems and submit those to the county for permitting, either to get the improvement permit, which is kind of a step one permit, or the actual construction authorization, which is the step two and final permit. So we, as a company, do a lot of session law submittals. We think it's always in the client's best interest to actually get a permit and not just give them an advisory opinion, because unfortunately advisory opinions are subject to change when the county gets out there to check behind. So we've seen that as a potential liability concern for folks who operate that way.
Yeah, we just so again from our standpoint, I
Yeah,
mean, every time that we've done it, we've at least gotten the IP, the improvement permit. You know, when it comes to cost effectiveness and that, I mean, that's where sometimes you got to just determine if it's worth continuing on, right?
yeah, exactly.
As far as the investor standpoint, I mean, because when you start getting into like we got a property right now that you did that had issues. We knew it had issues when we bought it. And it went to a septic engineer and they're doing an engineered system and that's going to get approved. But that property is near the beach and it's not going to have a problem selling with somebody putting in a what, $25,000-$30,000 septic system because they're going to build a $500,000 house. It's not going to be an issue there. Whereas if you're dealing with a mobile home lot, that somebody's not going to drop in that kind of system, right? And so right. It's got to be cost effective to what we're doing, and that's where knowing this information comes into play. And sometimes we just take a stab in the dark. I mean, as investors, sometimes it just makes sense. I mean, you're buying a piece of property for a few $100s, and if it doesn't perk, who cares? Somebody will still buy it for something. You know, somebody will buy it and do something with it down the road or whatever. We still, those are really low end ones. So sometimes we just don't even worry about these things. Yep. But in other cases, you know, the ones that he's talked about, like what he did for us, I mean, that these are $30,000, $40,000, $50,000 profits on these other type of deals. So this is where it makes sense, you know, getting somebody involved and finding out where you stand. Plus, in those cases, for me, you know, we actually had an outlay of money going in. It wasn't going to be $1,000 purchase. You know, we're talking about $10,000, $15,000 purchases. And so it's like, well, to spend a little bit of extra money to get somebody involved and then know where we're standing and all of that stuff does make a difference. So, you know, just so everybody understands these different steps. I mean, it's kind of like it's a pecking order of how it'll go, but you're not locked in. I mean, you can back out and you hire them or whoever, and then they tell you, no, it can't be anything done. It needs an engineered system and it's a property you're buying for $3,000 and it's worth 15,000. You may go back to your owner and tell our seller and say straight up, this is the situation. I'll give you $500 for it and take your chances, or you just back out of the deal, and just basically say it didn't work and you lose your money now that you spent on testing. But, that's just the cost of doing business at some point. So just so you understand, everybody that's listening from our perspective, why this makes sense and how it works and when it works and all that kind of thing.
Exactly. Yeah. And one other thing I'll add to that too is it's important to work with the private sector professional that you hire to engage in these services, to make sure they understand that their role is to give you the soil opinion of the property and permitting opinion as well, and not make those financial decisions for you. We've seen in rare circumstances where sometimes those lines will bleed over a little bit, to where someone will go out there, maybe they didn't have a good grasp on what the client was trying to accomplish, and maybe it's a challenging lot, and they say, nah, there's nothing that can be done here. This lot's non-constructable. It's really important, I think, for the soil professionals out there to remember, that their role is to identify the soil conditions and hopefully get folks permits, and let the development community and investors or whoever it may be make the decision on, well, do we want to pursue actually obtaining a permit in these circumstances, or should we walk with the property? So just something to keep in mind in that negotiation between client and soil professional, to make sure that, yeah, maybe a challenging lot, maybe an expensive system, but I would think on the development side of things, y'all would at least want to know, hey, those may be the case, but there is a solution still out there.
Yeah, I mean, we got one right now, just again to bring it into like real world that he's doing for us, that we've kind of established a pecking order basically of how we want it. He's looking at the soil as preliminary. There's maybe some questions. And so it's like, well, if we can get this, normal system, conventional system, 3-bedroom, perfect, but if we can't, it allows mobile homes. So we're like, well, maybe we can get a 2-bedroom system. Maybe there's enough there to get a 2-bedroom system. And then it's also zoned for like commercial use. Commercial use systems are different. So then we said, well, maybe you can go down to the commercial use system at that point. And then finally would be the engineered one at the end, which honestly for us would be a no-go in this property, because probably just not worth it. It's not worth that thing. But if we can that's our fourth option. So if we can work our way down, from those different things and still get something else to work, it would sell decently and things like that. And then obviously if it becomes an engineered system type thing, then what we have into it is pretty minor. We wouldn't go forward with the engineered system. It wouldn't be worth it, but we could sell it at a very discounted price. And like he said, at least the next person would know where it sits, and then maybe they'll do something with it or whatever at that point. So different options, that come into place there. But there, you can also it's good to have those conversations. Hey, this is where I stand as the investor. This is what I'm doing, looking at, can we do this? Can we kind of go down this line? And that's exactly what he's doing. In fact, that one's like, I think we're doing that, in like a week or something, or there's 2 weeks or something like that.
Half, yeah.
Yeah. So
yeah, no, good point. Yeah, there's definitely a hierarchy to a lot of these things. So a lot of those conversations can be had on the front end with a project between client and soil professional, to make sure that there's an understanding of, there's viable paths that is the client willing to explore. Otherwise, maybe not the case, but still always important to relay the soil information and permitting aspect accurately, because your client may not be using that information, but it may be useful in any future deal, that someone who wants to come along and maybe tackle something that's a little more challenging can still then accomplish with the work that's already been done. So having said that, you can kind of see here the other time benefits of hiring a soil professional, especially on the front end. In this case, we get out there pretty quickly. We'll evaluate the soil conditions across the whole property, trying to, at least the way we do it, identify a location, or the most feasible location in the constraints of the site plan as well, to identify where that septic system is going to go. Sometimes that's constrained by the site plan itself. Some projects, it's just the client says, find me the best area, for the cheapest and most cost-effective system. We'll design the site plan around it. So each project's going to be a little different in that case, But having the soil classifier come out on the front end usually gives folks more flexibility in being able to make those decisions. In this case, if we do find good soil conditions, then we're sending our work to the state or county to either get the septic permit here in South Carolina, or as Jonathan mentioned, the improvement permit or construction authorization, depending on where the project is at in North Carolina. One thing I'll say about that is it can be helpful to go ahead and just under session law get the construction authorization. So let's say you're working with a builder, something like that, they already have the house plans picked out. We always would just recommend, hey, you have everything you need for construction authorization. We'll lay out the system if we can. Let's just go ahead and get that final permit. Don't add this additional step in the process. But on more front end kind of deals where you're coming in as the developer, maybe you're purchasing the site, you just want to make sure that these sites are going to work for a general house plan or footprint. So we can kind of estimate what that would look like. And so in those cases, we're usually getting an improvement permit to say, yeah, for this site, we can do up to maybe a 5-bedroom house. We've got a 60 by 80 house footprint, and there's plenty of space to do what you want to do with the house and the septic area. One thing to keep in mind with that is most septic systems from a design perspective are going to be based on the bedroom count, and the soil texture is going to be the other usual limiting factor in an actual system footprint. So let's say we go out to a site, do the testing out there, say, okay, this acre lot, based on the soil conditions and what we anticipate would be a future house construction, could work for 4 bedrooms. Here's the layout. Here's what we'll submit to the county. You get your improvement permit. The thing that sometimes comes up is then you have a future buyer who comes in and says, well, I want to do 6 bedrooms. It's not to say they couldn't do it. And if the licensed professional who's doing that work understands the goal is to get the most number of bedrooms permitted on the front end, then it kind of solves what could happen next. But in those cases, you're usually having to reevaluate the site in order to determine if a future buyer is going to be able to do what their plans are for the property. So we look at it as, let's try and get the most number of bedrooms on the front end for the site as we can, and kind of let the chips fall where they may if someone wants to come down the road and do something different. So that's just a conversation that usually is also had on the front end with the professional, licensed professional and client. But you can see here a much more expedited time frame going through a soil professional on the front end. Here in South Carolina, again, the state's going to have a mandated turnaround time where we submit work to them. It's going to be a lot quicker than the 4 to 12 weeks you're going to wait on them. You're looking at about 1 to 2 weeks in soil turnaround time for our services, about 1 to 2 weeks in regulatory review, and then you have a permit in hand. Equally with with an engineered solution, something that's going to be a little more expensive and advanced. We're knowing that's going to be the case on the front end. So those would be circumstances where we're out there doing the testing ahead of the state or county. We know based on our soil testing that there's no way those entities would be issuing a permit. And so now the client's not having to wait until the end of the county's whole review process to learn this information. And so now we're getting them over to the next step of the process, which is usually a PE or septic engineer, to assist in the design elements to get that engineered or more advanced septic permit. So we're just kind of cutting the line, if you will, of having to get that opinion from DHEC, or again, the county health department. So recap, you can see here, going through the counties or state health departments, going to be a lot slower process. You can see your best case scenario without a licensed soil professional is about as fast as the worst case scenario would be actually using a licensed professional. So I know one of the biggest comments that we get, especially from folks purchasing property for development, is time is money. How can we turn these projects around as quickly as possible to do more deals? And really the only way to do that quickly, efficiently, at scale, and getting the best possible information for that project is going to be to go through the private sector. So I'll touch real quick on preliminary mapping. As I mentioned earlier, this is usually something that's done, at least on our end, for large scale development. So this would be where, let's say, a developer, either themselves or a large home builder, comes in. They've got a 100-acre tract, and they say, "Yeah, we'd like to do this on septic." It's really important for those individuals to understand where good soil conditions on the property may be and where bad soil conditions may be as they work to finalize their civil site plan for the project. I can't tell you how many times I've seen folks do this in reverse, where they purchase the property, they come up with a civil site plan, we get out there to do the testing, and the way they configure their lots or property is in such a way where they're actually increasing overall development costs, meaning that they've aggregated higher density per se in bad soil conditions. And so it's like, well, if you would have done this on the front end, you could have aggregated your density up here, planned around that, gotten more lots potentially, or gotten the same number of lots just with more lower cost septic systems. So it's really important to, when you're doing that kind of development, to, in our opinion, do this work on the front end and not try and find a solution on the back end. So this is just a quick example of that. We're using elevation modeling here in this project in the Piedmont to kind of understand where good soil conditions may be, where bad soil conditions may be. Just for reference here for discussion, the green elevations are going to be lower lying parts of the property, things where we would likely run into, say, a shallow water table or other limiting factors. The areas in orange and red are going to be higher in elevation. On the picture on the right, you can also see the Nrcs soil mapping. This was done primarily for the Southeast region from the 30s all the way up through the 1980s. This is where the actual Nrcs, the government agency, went out, did soil mapping to help primarily the farm community understand soil conditions from an agricultural perspective. This resource gets cited all the time by folks in the real estate community. They say, "Oh, this property is mapped Cecil. This is going to be good soil." Cecil is a good soil series for septic. The problem is the mapping work that was done at the government level really has some, how to put it gently, there's some variability in the accuracy of that data. Some areas are accurate, other areas not so great. And so that really has implications for, folks, if they just are using that data to make real estate purchase decisions. You're relying on data that is highly inaccurate. Maybe at best 50% of the time you'll see some accuracy to that. But the way that work was conducted, they literally went out every 10,000 feet, plugged a hole using topo maps, then created these soil maps. So when we do a test, it's much more site specific. We're going to get more granular data that usually is going to conflict what the Nrcs mapping shows.
So real quick on that,
Mhm.
again, and I don't even know the answer to this. You can just answer it because you did that property for us. That was the one near the beach. And that one showed like great soils. It
Mhm.
was like sandy and should have like been, and then you were basically like, you need an engineered system and it can only be in this corner. And
Yep.
were they wrong or was there a deviation there? I mean, something happened in that where what I thought it was no problem because, I knew going in there could be some issues based on what other people were telling me, but something like just in that example didn't add up.
Yeah, so at the end of the day, yeah, I mean, you could say that NRCS was wrong. Again, keep in mind when they did that testing, it wasn't to be utilized in such a way to map every little nook and cranny of where different soil conditions may exist. They were going every 10,000 feet, digging a hole, using the USGS topo maps in conjunction with their data to then try and draw lines where they thought different landform positions may be, how then their mapping exercise corresponded to that. So very, very macro level approach to soil mapping. When we're doing this, it's very site specific. we use technology like you can see here with the LiDAR data. This, depending on locality, may have been flown in the mid to late 2000s. So also going to depend on how robust that data was, depending on the level of county funding when this was done. Some counties have really great LiDAR data, some don't. So LiDAR data is basically where they fly an airplane, they shoot light down to the ground. The light bounces back up to a receiver on the plane, and then they correspond how long it takes for that light to bounce back to an elevation. So the longer it takes that light to bounce back, the lower the elevation, because that's greater delta from the plane to the ground. So it's not 100% perfect. Again, each county is going to have different levels of accuracy to their LiDAR data, but it is a step in the right direction, at least compared to the way things were done 40 or 50 years ago. However, we still have to do per lot testing to make sure that soil conditions are going to be accurate, because even the LiDAR data may not capture everything.
Have you noticed? Because we've kind of taken, like I said, we've rolled the dice a few times with properties just because it makes sense. If the property is like dead center in that, like the property that I just talked about 2 minutes ago, that one was like the very far edge. We knew it was the very far edge, and like it was already in that transition. And you I think you even told me, like, if you were 100 feet further away, you would have been fine. But because of where I was, but have you found that generally speaking, it's you've got this big area that's whatever, it's good soil, and it's showing as good soil from this testing, and your property's like right here, dead center. Does that generally mean that it's or is it still just completely haphazard and could be anything?
No, it's still completely haphazard. Those line boundaries that you'll see on a soil survey from NRCS are, again, they're arbitrary. They're best guesses at the end of the day. Sometimes it's accurate, sometimes the boundary may be accurate, but I would say more often than not, it is just truly a best guess. In the lot we're talking about here, on the coast, that one very much was a case where if you went 100 feet away upslope, we would have been dealing with a conventional system. It was just that this property in particular was at the edge of the hill slope, at the edge of the dune, in the lower lying elevation, and being on the coastal plain, this is an area where we're typically going to see very shallow water tables. So the area in that case where we were able to get enough vertical separation from the soil surface to the water table was really the only area on that property that will suit for a septic system. But yeah, as far as the mapping is concerned, it's just guesswork, but it's definitely not something that should be relied upon heavily in making real estate decisions as far as septic permitting is going to be concerned. So with that, you can see here, again, with this property being a proposed neighborhood, you can see the lots kind of marked here on the property. You can see the proposed cul-de-sac, proposed roads for the development. So generally speaking, we're looking at this LiDAR, we're looking at the soil mapping, and when we lay out our preliminary testing on something like this, what we really want to capture is where we believe there to be changes in landform. So maybe from the top of a hill summit to now the side slope, and then maybe the foot slope or floodplain. We want to be able to capture that change, because you're going to have different soil conditions in a changing landscape position like that. And then we also do want to just take into account that with the soil mapping, they probably had some level of accuracy in determining that, maybe the soil over here had a little bit more clay, maybe it was a little more sand over here, maybe over there was more rock that they were running into. So we will look at it in that case just to kind of help guide our preliminary layout for test borings. But from an accuracy standpoint, as far as what they actually mapped, that's subject to change. So here you can see the checkered flags. This is where we laid out our actual boring locations. So trying to capture the darker green floodway through there, trying to capture the somewhat yellow-green, maybe foot or toe slope of the hill, and then also capturing the side slope there in orange and the summit in the red areas. Those are all areas where we're going to see different soil conditions likely pop up, and so we want to capture the change through those areas because they're going to have an effect on the not only the type of system, but maybe even the system size based on those soil conditions. So another example here of the results of our testing. The areas in blue represent from our test results locations where we feel that given sufficient space for a system, these should work for conventional septic. The areas in yellow, due to either lot size or combination of lot size and poor soil conditions, are now going to require a more advanced engineered solution. So that's kind of an overview of how we would approach a preliminary site assessment. Again, most people are going to be doing that on from a preliminary stance in trying to ascertain the lot size question, development capabilities of a property. Some soil scientists out there, especially in North Carolina, may just do that as their highest level of service, just to go out to say a single lot or a development like this and say, here's what we think you'll get, but we don't want to handle the permitting aspect of it. Most though soil professionals, especially the mid to larger size companies, are going to still take that to the next step of trying to obtain a permit in most cases. And that my personal opinion is the better position to be in.
Yeah, I mean, just to go back to what I talked about earlier with the lot that we did that was similar to that, 14 properties.
Mm-hmm.
So kind of ran into similar issues with what you showed there. So what we did was we worked with them to get in normal systems, conventional systems, but because of that, we lost some land, right? Because it had to be bigger properties to get these ones on this side are 3/4 of an acre, but you need 2.5. I think the largest was like 2 3/4 acre. Yep. At the other end, they needed 2 3/4 acre to be able to get to property that. Why did we do that? Because we knew that those lots wouldn't conventional systems dropping a $30,000 system. Engineered system wouldn't have worked in that area with those. So we were like, okay, we just need conventional system. So we made the decision. It wasn't with Tyler, it was with somebody else that we met before this a few years ago. Well, instead of getting 20 lots or 19 lots or whatever it was with a number of them having engineered systems, let's get 14 with conventional systems across the board. And maybe really quick, I mean, I don't know if you're going to get to this or not, but I'm sure it might be a question that's going to come on people's own. I mean, what are those terms? We're using them because we know what they mean, but what is a conventional system? What's an engineered system? What's in the middle? There's mound systems, maybe just a few minutes on those different things. Or if you want to save it to the end, we can. It doesn't really matter. But I mean, just a little bit so that people are hearing these terms. It's like, what are they even talking about? Right?
Yeah, exactly. So I assume you're using your psychic abilities today, Jonathan, because that's actually where we're heading next. Yeah, so I'll kind of run through the regulations very quickly for each of these states, and then we'll definitely jump into what those terms mean, what these different system types are, things of that nature. So septic regulations, each state again is going to be different in this. South Carolina, these regulations are listed under Regulation Code 6156. There's some current proposed changes to those regs we're currently working through. So if you really want to get into what changes those are, how things are actually regulated in the state, I'll let you read through not only the existing regs, but the proposed changes. And then, in North Carolina, those are listed under what are called the 1900 regulations. These regulations across state lines, but basically kind of outline the different types of systems that can be utilized, the soil conditions that have to be present in order to permit those systems specifically. There's a lot of other information in there, but that's really the main takeaway of what is listed in those regulation codes. So what is a septic system? For folks who've never kind of seen one of these be installed, it's really just a system to convey wastewater in the subsurface of the soil conditions. Generally speaking, you're going to have an outlet out of the main primary housing structure that's going to feed into a septic tank. Depending on the type of system, it's either going to be a tank by itself. There may be additional treatment components to that tank in really advanced systems, engineered kind of solutions. It may just have a pump chamber in it, which is fairly simple. One of the main, I think, confusing things that we see out there sometimes is folks will see systems that get permitted with a effluent pump. All that is the placement of the drain field in relation to the tank and house means the effluent from the tank or the wastewater from the tank has to flow uphill to the drain field. And so you use a little pump chamber to basically pump it upslope. Those pumps are really cheap. They're about $1,000 to the additional cost of the system. I know sometimes I've heard folks confuse a pump tank with an actual engineered pre-treatment system. And so it's really important to understand this terminology in the sense when you're trying to figure out system costs, that an actual just effluent pump is a very easy thing to add to a system, very low cost addition. Treatment tanks and things we're going to talk about here next, a little bit higher cost.
Yeah, that one that we talked about, or I talked about, the 14 lots, a few of them have those pumps in them.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, basically people like freaked out when they were, pumps in it. No. It's a small cost and it's just moving the water elsewhere. And then they're like, oh, okay. I'm like, it's still a conventional system. And, but buyers, they hear certain things and then they kind of like, freak out hearing those terms. So, but that is, that's a perfect example where you got a pretty low end, low cost system. And it's just moving it. Like I said, it was, one of those lots was like 2 3/4 acres. So it's like the house is going to be over here and it needs to be way over there. So it needs to just get there somehow.
Exactly. Yep. Yeah, common misconception for sure. So as far as type of systems go, I personally like to break it up into two larger umbrellas, non-engineered systems and engineered systems. This is a better kind of way to think of it, at least in South Carolina. North Carolina, again, because soil scientists can technically design very high-end treatment systems that typically in the past engineers were designing, the nomenclature gets a little muddied because then there is no engineer involved in that process. But for the most part, non-engineered systems are going to be much lower cost, going to be easier to develop or construct as well as permit. Engineered systems or more advanced type of systems usually going to require an engineer and are going to, in certain circumstances, have a higher cost point. So we'll start with non-engineered systems. What most folks think of as a conventional septic system. There's certain codes in each of these sets of regulations that kind of outline what this would be. Here in South Carolina, it's code 100, 210, or 220. Sometimes these are called traditional systems, conventional systems, or shallow systems. That nomenclature also does carry over to North Carolina. They refer to them as conventional systems in the regulation code, or as shallow systems, depending on the soil conditions and install depth. Generally, though, in South Carolina, we need water table depths of at least 21 inches or greater. North Carolina, that would be 24 inches or greater, but that's going to allow you to basically dig a trench, put in your aggregate supply system, whether that be rock or alternative product, or well, those being the main two things, rock or alternative product. Here in South Carolina, there's more specific listing of types of alternative product in North Carolina that can be used. But as long as you're installing that trench at enough depth, covering it back up, final product is going to be where the ground is returned to the same elevation as before. You don't see any, mound or fill cap on it. The system is completely in the ground. Those are going to be the lowest cost systems available. So typically from a soil testing perspective, when someone hires us to go do work, we're trying to always design the most cost-effective system we can. So where we have good soil conditions, this is what we would typically be looking for. We also have here in South Carolina what are called modified conventional systems. Sometimes these are called fill cap systems, as is the case in North Carolina. In South Carolina, this would be where you have water table depths of at least 12 inches or greater. In North Carolina, that would also potentially be the case on the system type. It'd either be 12 inches or greater using low pressure pipe, or 18 inches or greater using some sort of conventional or otherwise alternative aggregate system. Really, the main focus though with this is it's a system that goes into the ground a little bit closer to the soil surface because there's not a lot of depth between the actual system and the ground surface elevation. You're bringing in usually about a foot or less material to cover over where that system is, just to make sure it's not going to bubble up or anything like that. So you cap that system to make sure everything flows vertically downward. These systems usually are a little bit more expensive than conventional just because you're having to bring in material, but certainly not approaching the cost of, again, an engineered system. This specifically is going to be more geared towards South Carolina. Here we have what are called wide bed systems. In North Carolina, sometimes you'll see bed systems utilized in similar fashion, but what we're doing here, it's no different in our design of the system, as I mentioned before, with like a conventional or fill cap system. We're just increasing the trench width, which is going to allow us to decrease the overall surface area or square footage of that system. So it gives us a little bit more flexibility on smaller lots or where the site plan is really tight in order to hopefully make a non-engineered system work. So now we'll jump over to what we routinely see as as an engineered system. There's various types of engineered systems out there depending on the state you're in. Here in South Carolina, the main two that we're going to see are these elevated mound systems, especially on the coastal plain. You'll see these in North Carolina as well, typically referred to as a Brunswick bed system, I believe. However, the regulation codes between the two different states kind of differ in when you may use these systems. South Carolina, we typically see them in challenging soil conditions, especially with shallow water tables. And really, from a functional standpoint, these work exactly like a conventional system. All you're doing is building the system above the ground elevation to get above the water table. So you just need more material to build them up. So you may raise the actual surface elevation where that system is going to be by about 2 to 2.5 feet. Similar in North Carolina with these Brunswick bed systems, they just don't allow for as poor of soil conditions for their use as we are allowed to use here in South Carolina. And then this is usually what most folks are going to refer to from at least what I've seen when talking about engineered systems. These are sometimes called advanced treatment systems, sometimes called pre-treatment systems, drip irrigation systems. There's a whole gamut of language when talking about these. The main takeaway though with these is the cost is actually wrapped up in the treatment tank itself. So a normal septic tank treats the wastewater in the sense that the wastewater goes into the tank, the solids filter downward, and then the wastewater moves into the drain field where the actual treatment, for the most part, happens in the soil as the wastewater moves through the soil and then eventually interacts with the groundwater. In a pre-treatment solution or system, the treatment actually happens almost entirely in the tank itself. So the wastewater will go into the tank, depending on the type of tank and technology it's using, is going to treat the wastewater so that most of the harmful bacteria is captured or eliminated in the tank. From there, it's going out into typically a pressurized drip irrigation field. If you've seen irrigation tubing before, same type of product, just in a pressurized environment. It's then dosed, so it's sequenced out when that wastewater is going to then leave the drip tubing and then pressurized release into the soil conditions. It's a much higher quality of wastewater coming out of that system, again, because of the treatment happening in the tank. In North Carolina specifically, though, you may see pre-treatment tanks utilized with a variety of different drain field product. So drip irrigation tubing is the most common that we would usually see. But you can use treatment with low pressure pipe. You can use it with alternative aggregate products like infiltrator chambers, which are just these little plastic chambers that you put into the actual trench. T&J panel, another solution you can use it with. So North Carolina gives you a little bit more flexibility on how you can kind of stack or combine different products and solutions to make something work. But across the board, we usually see it used with that drip irrigation solution. Again, these systems are going to cost more, though. They're higher, and there's more technology that goes into them. There's a lot more liability that goes into them. They're a more advanced type of system. So personally speaking, from our company's perspective, we don't design pre-treatment systems. In South Carolina, we would be unable to do it just based on their typical use in a engineered environment. So the engineer is usually doing that work. And then in North Carolina, we typically don't design these systems because, again, of the additional liability, the operations and maintenance that goes into them, which lies with the permitting party to convey that information to the client or to the permit holder. So usually an engineer historically has gotten involved in that process. And in North Carolina, usually that's through what's called the engineered option permit. All the liability in that case lies with the engineer. They're responsible for the oversight of the construction. They're usually having pre-con meetings with county officials to talk about these things. But you can see just in this description, there's a higher kind of standard of care when dealing with advanced treatment systems that, for our sake, we prefer to work with an engineer to kind of assist with. But that's really an overview of most of the different system types out there. Let my contact information kind of sit up here if you need it at the moment. I'm sure Jonathan will certainly give that out here at the end of the presentation and Q&A and everything. But that is really, at the end of the day, an overview of everything that we do as a licensed professional in these two states. I would highly encourage you, if you're working in other states, to kind of work with those licensed folks in those areas to understand the different nuances that may exist, because each state may be different. Certain states may not even have a regulatory framework or licensure framework for professionals, just because there's either not been a demand for it, the counties or health departments can keep up with the work because they're better funded, or because soil conditions in those areas and states are a little bit more uniform and you don't run into challenging environments that we see in states that do have these programs. So with that, Jonathan, if there's anything that I missed that you think would be a good topic to cover, we can certainly go there, or we can open it up to Q&A. I'll let you kind of decide where we go from here.
Yeah, all right. So everybody, if you have questions, feel free to post them here on the comments for either whatever, whether you're watching on YouTube or Facebook or whatever. We're monitoring that. A couple of things as we're going on here. Maybe some of this stuff was a little over your head. Some of it was over my head. You don't need to know that. You're not the one that got the education. He is, right? I mean, he was kind of telling you that, and that's why you work with people like this. But it's just something that can help as far as decision making. A lot of times we're letting our buyers, because we're obviously putting properties out that. So, for example, let me just throw this out there. We may have a property that we have questions on. It looks good, but we may have questions on it. So we market it for sale because we have the right to do that. We don't own it yet. Well, then if you keep getting asked about, everybody's going to use the perc test. Has it been perc? Has it been perc test? Has it been perc? That's where you could make the decision now. Well, am I going to hire somebody does it make sense, right? To hire somebody to go do that work and find that out? Or do I want to, just keep it going, lower the price? You got a lot of different options that you can choose, but this is just an extra layer that you can bring in as a vacant land investor. And that's something that, we've done on a few different deals because it's substantially added to profits. The one that we've been talking about where it turned into a conventional system because he just went the other direction. That was a property that was listed for in the 20s and 20,000s, and it wasn't selling because of these things. And then it actually failed the perc test because somebody went the other direction with it. And then he came out and it passed, and we have it under contract in the 40s now to sell. So it's a big difference there with that. The other thing is, and you could talk about this or I could talk about it. I don't care because maybe you don't want to, but because you said you're not going to badmouth the county and stuff. Personally, I don't like them. And the reason I don't like them isn't just the timing. It's the people that are going out are not scientists. They work under that, right? Every county has I believe every county has a licensed soil scientist, right? That has to be like the governing person. But the people under them just go out, they dig holes, they look at stuff. I think a lot of them are still doing perc tests, like you said. they're not even going beyond that in some cases. So, there is, beside the time factor, the quality factor, right? I mean, just the fact that I go back to my lot, the county went out and it failed. And he went out and called me and was like, I went this direction and there's fine soil. So, I mean, if you want to speak about that just for a minute,
Sure.
the quality, because we talked about the timing factor, right? But the quality factor is something there too.
Yeah, no doubt. I mean, as far as my background is concerned, I spent 4 years with the Army Corps of Engineers as a wetland permitting specialist. I served as their soil scientist for the Charleston district here for that time period, and yeah, the quality is going to vary. It's it's government work, and you can insert whatever jokes you want about that, and I think half the time it's probably valid. And this being at the state or county level, that quality may be magnified quite a bit more. So yeah, we see quality issues from time to time, whether it be permits that do end up getting issued that we, for whatever reason, were asked to come take a second look on, and we're a little hesitant to agree with the permit that may have been issued, but it is what it is. And circumstances like you had mentioned on this property where just maybe having a better understanding of soil and landscape morphology from having someone who actually has that background could have maybe gotten a different result rather than just, I'm just going to go out here and dig a quick hole and, oh, well, it didn't pass, off I go to the next one. Because I do think sometimes folks, in their bid to get more work done, may have to sacrifice the quality. And that's not to say that's people having ill intent, in doing that. The other thing you have to understand is most of these government agencies that do this work are extremely overworked. There's lack of staff, there's usually lack of funding, and their whole thing is, they've got lists of projects a mile long, and so they may not really be incentivized because of the structure of their organizations to go out there and spend 20, 30 minutes, an hour on a site to try and make something work. Their goal and role in that capacity really is just dig my hole, yes or no, and I got to get to the next one. So there's a lot of things at play that kind of influence why that quality issue may exist. But personally speaking, and from other case studies and examples, and from people we've heard from, there is no doubt there is a quality difference between private sector work and what you're going to get going through the county or state government.
Yeah, and part of that, I mean, that we've noticed too is, I don't know if lazy is the right word that these people are, but maybe like the path of least resistance. It's kind of like at the project, it's like, oh, brush, clear grass. Let's just go to the clear grass without anything. I mean, the brush could be a foot deep and could be great soils, and it's higher up, and it just looks, everything makes sense, but it's like, nope, that's clear right there. Let's just go over there. And then it's like, no, it didn't work. It's like,
well, and I mean, yeah, I think that's part of it too. You're a county or state employee, you make what you make, and you're not really incentivized to go above and beyond. I'm not, North Carolina, the fees are a little bit higher to request the county to do work than they are here in South Carolina. It's paltry what you can pay here. You pay $150 in South Carolina to go do a soil test. But we tell people all the time, it's the same thing. You get what you pay for, and you pay $150, and in certain circumstances, you get $150 worth of quality. So yes, the private sector for the most part is going to be more expensive to see things through the whole process. That's due to technology that's being used, equipment, things of that nature. But you are going to 9 times out of 10 you're going to get a better read on the property. You may not get the result you like, but it's going to be a more thorough analysis.
Yeah, and in some cases, I mean, just so everybody understands, like for example, that lot that we did near the coast, the county would have just came out and failed. That's it.
Correct.
There's no secondary, and tertiary things that follow it. It's basically like the one we're working on now, it's like they would just come out and they would look at it from one perspective and they would fail it. Whereas we're like, let's follow this line, right? So out there, it was like, we kind of knew when we were going in, it was going to be an engineer. It says, okay, fine, that one's worth it. And so I'm not going to do the work. I'm not dropping in a $30,000 septic system. Don't get me wrong, because I'm not the developer. But what I am doing is he put me in contact with a septic engineer. They design the system. They're going to get, that approval on the lot. Now I can just sell it out with an approved system, and somebody else can go in and do that work. And I'm just paying for that actual design aspect and permitting and all of that. With the other lot that you're doing in a week or two, that one's like, again, I'm saying, well, we talked about it earlier, this like chain of let's try it here. And if this doesn't work, let's try this. And if that doesn't work, let's try this. And if that doesn't, we've got like 4 things. County's not going to do that. County's going to go out. They're going to do it. And it's like, nope, didn't work for the thing we were looking at, and we're done, so that is a huge difference, and from the land investing standpoint, I'm gonna tell you guys right now, for those who watch, obviously you're watching it for that reason. The properties that we sold last year or have under contract that I worked with other soil scientists before or with him and sold or have under contract have made us more money than our other deals, because they were a little bit higher value and because they were a little bit better and because we took those extra steps, instead of just walking away from them. Now, there's certain ones, again, that didn't make any sense. I had one that just happened, just so everybody understands, like literally this week, it was a cheap property. And it was under contract for $7,000. And the people that were buying it were builders. They hired their own soil scientists, and he said it failed. I'm not going to push that one because it's $7,000. $7,000 is the sale price. It's not worth it, but on these higher end ones, it's like, it makes a lot more sense. So that's huge. And just so everybody else understands on this too, I mean, we are talking very state specific, North Carolina, South Carolina here. Things change all over the place. We've had people that have come on here. We were talking about this ahead of time. Maybe you could talk about a little bit. I've had people from California and Arizona and stuff, and they're like, we don't even know what a perc test is basically what they're saying, and Florida, I don't know. I lived in Florida for 10 years, and like, it seemed like nothing failed in Florida, which is the weirdest thing to me because the water table is so low. It's like, so they might just have very laid back regulations in the state of Florida. I have no idea. Northeast is where I grew up in Connecticut. It was only private sector. That's all you could use. You had to hire somebody like Tyler. He had to go out and do that and then basically give his report to the county, and all they would do is issue a permit at that point. There was no other option. So this is very state specific, but on top of being state specific, it's also like the regulations per state are hugely different, right?
Correct. Yeah, 100%. Good, case or study on that or example is, and I think Wisconsin, I think they use these in Georgia. They're called Wisconsin mounds. They're huge, 50, 60, 100 by 100 mounds that are 4 or 5 feet up in the air. And they use them in certain circumstances because the soil conditions and the opinion of those states would require it, because you want to treat your system in this contained kind of structure. We have something similar to that here in South Carolina. It's not as gargantuan as in some of these states, but yeah, it's going to be specific to the state. They're going to look at it from a demand standpoint. They're going to look at it from a soil condition standpoint. So, some of these Western states, we've talked to folks in Colorado before that do this, and those communities, either the county does it or they have just a select number of engineers that usually work as a subcontractor in some circumstances with the county to do it, because the soil conditions are so uniform. There's not this variability you may see in other geographic regions. Soil conditions may influence that. So same thing in Colorado. You may see systems across the board be installed 8, 10, 20 feet down because all they're trying to do is just place it in an area where they're not having rock. And so you can just do that by just digging a hole and see where you find those conditions. Here in the Southeast, you have a wide variety of different soil conditions. You also have a lot of soil science programs at the university level that I think produce folks who do this work. And so many state legislatures across time have seen value in being able to get licensed, educated people to be able to do this work from a liability standpoint, saying, hey, we want these systems to work. Let's get people who know soil to do this. The Northeast, for example, like you said, is all private sector, and that's a huge liability reason for why that market is the way it is. In the Northeast, Ohio, Pennsylvania, those areas specifically, you get a lot of what are called slick and slides. You get a lot of expansive bentonite type clays. You get shale, all of which are things that really don't allow for the permeability of water and wastewater to move through. And so you're having to figure out these unique, difficult solutions in really poor soil conditions. So in those areas, they say, hey, this is not something that government wants to take on. Licensed professionals in the private sector need to figure out how to do this because they have some really bad soil conditions up there.
Yeah. And honestly, I mean, from the investing standpoint, it's not a huge cost to hire somebody to do these things to get the better results. It's just kind of been our, the way we're not doing this on every property, right?
Sure.
So it's like when we're looking at these properties that it makes sense, it's like, why even have the county involved? Especially when it could be I mean, you gave some examples. I mean, I had one county tell me that they were 4 months before they'd even touch it, and then who knows how long it's going to be. So it's like, it's not really, to me, it's like the cost is it's the cost of doing business. I mean, honestly, that's all it is. It's the cost of doing business. So
we see that too in our outreach efforts, and as we've done more work across different states. There's an initial pushback. People say, oh, I have to spend $1,000 or $1,500 or whatever the market rate sets for this work. I'm used to paying $100, $200, maybe $300, depending on where you're at with the county. That's a huge cost increase in these services. But then you go through it once or twice, and like you said, there's almost immediate value on the first project you do. And then you start to question, well, why would I use the government process to do this when the quality may be lower, the time frames are going to be lower, they can't do it at scale. And so that's not to say there's not a role for those entities to play. We sometimes advise people, hey, if you have the time and think you have really good soil conditions, by all means, wait for the county or state to do the work. The way the market is currently, most people don't have that luxury. And as we've done more work, people, I think, have certainly seen the value, and just the cost of doing business becomes a lot more comfortable for this kind of stuff.
Yeah, and a lot of that depends on the actual. I mean, you mentioned South Carolina and those low fees, but North Carolina is nothing like that. I mean, the difference in cost in North Carolina, it's like not even double, and so it's like, because they're so expensive to begin with, and North Carolina is also a state. This is a good conversation to have with whoever you're working with, if it's here or not. North Carolina is a very tough state as far as getting their regulations are very high. South Carolina's are not as high, so dealing with things. And like I mentioned, Florida, I mean, Florida, I lived there for 10 years. We've done stuff there and I never heard of any issues. And Florida's probably got the lowest water table in the country, right? Or highest water. I don't know how that high or low, but whatever. It's closest to the top. So, every state I'm sure is different. So that's, having that conversation and knowing before you're even getting into things, where it is. Someone asked if the property is not in a flood zone, but it shows marsh, what can you do with marshland? Can you build in marshland, or what's marshland? How does that apply?
It's a great question. Again, another question we get very often. The biggest thing I can say with this is it's important to remember each site is going to be unique in its own way. The information that's out there that's available to the public to plan around a lot of these questions as far as it relates to floodplain, wetlands, marsh, etc., is not really usable at the end of the day. We'll start with floodplain. So floodplains are a designation determined by FEMA. All that is they look at the elevations and say these areas are lower lying elevation. Based on their modeling, they suspect they'll flood at a certain interval of time, whether that's within a 500-year flood, 1,000-year flood, whatever the case may be. So we've had plenty of properties, that may be at elevation 6, 7, whatever the case may be, but because of their landform position, they're on a higher landform than the surrounding properties. That may be a conventional system. Whereas if you go further inland, maybe your elevation is 34, 35 feet, but you're in a landform position that tends to accumulate water. Well, you may be doing an engineered system there. And so floodplain really isn't going to tell you much about septic permitting, other than it's a fact that really it's just a elevation number that the government has come up with to say, under some sort of flood event, we think this may be underwater. That's all it is. The other thing with that, going back to marshland or wetland, it depends on what we mean by that. So we're kind of transitioning to a separate discussion, so we'll touch on this a little bit. I don't want to get too much into the weeds. But a lot of counties and government agencies, in determining, what is needed for development of a property, use a resource called the National Wetland Inventory. It's publicly available. It's published by Fish and Wildlife. That resource, also developed in the 80s, was basically where they took aerial photography. They tried to draw where wetlands may exist. They did limited ground truthing to confirm this. So it's really guesswork at the end of the day. The problem is it's publicly available. So a lot of the public who doesn't interface with wetland regulation a whole lot sees it and they say, oh, this is where my wetlands are. This is where marshland may be. The only way to definitively tell where wetlands, and wetland being an actual regulatory term, it's regulated under the Clean Water Act, administered by the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers. The only way to determine if something is wetland is to actually hire someone to delineate where those areas may be on a property. And then second step, get that verified in writing by the Army Corps. For South Carolina and North Carolina, unless you have a wetland fill permit, you can't build a septic system in a wetland. When we talk about marshland, it's important to designate whether we mean that's actual wetland, like I'm saying here in this case, regulated by the Army Corps, or if you mean like tidal marsh, that's its own separate thing. So same circumstance, you're not going to build a septic system or development or something in tidal marsh. But with tidal marsh, the regulatory agencies from a septic perspective usually have some sort of offset that you have to stay from these areas. So in South Carolina, if your property abuts marshland, tidal marsh, you have to be at least 75 feet from the line that delineates where that marsh is with all of your septic components. So it's a 75-foot setback. North Carolina, that may go up to, I think, 200 or 250 feet, depending on the classification of waters. So that's also going to be state specific. But again, the main takeaway with that is it's important to know or understand, I guess, what item you're trying to answer in that question. Are we trying to figure out, is this wetland? What resources are we using? Is it wetland? Do we want to know if it's floodplain? All of which are going to be their own separate thing, but generally speaking, floodplain designation isn't going to affect septic permitting.
And building is different than, she asked about building. I mean, building is different because people put things on stilts and building a home and moving. I mean, I think you actually had a picture kind of like that, right? Where it was like the one you showed with the engineered system. So that is a little bit different. And I mean, again, an example, you did it, that 0.9 acres or just under, that had a stream running the entire northern edge. And when I reached out about that, before I was talking to Tyler, when I reached out to the county, that's exactly where the Army Corps of Engineers find out. And then when I talked to them, they were like, well, we can come out and we can do a delineation and we can do this. And it was totally unnecessary in this property because literally it was on the very northern edge. And yes, it was running along the entire street, but the property also bounded a street on the whole southern edge. So it was like, there was really, unless I wanted to like try to cut an extra lot out, and I had no interest. I was like, no, it's not worth it. It's like, we're just going to go for the conventional system from the south. It's a lot easier in that case. But we've had situations before where we only had one side of road frontage and we had something like that. And now it's like, how do we cross it? So, and that's where you need to get like these different entities involved and things like that. Or again, cut your losses or just not cut your losses, but just move on. Either say, I'm not doing this, or discount it down heavily and just move on and because there's plenty of people that do this type of stuff for work. So if you don't want to be going that further, somebody will pick that property up and still do that stuff, realizing that they can. It's just going to be time consuming. That's the nice thing, right? We're kind of at the bottom level. I call it pre-development, right? We don't do the development. We do like the initial little steps here to get it going, to give it to those people. So there are still plenty of options where we can make money, but we're not doing all of that stuff. But if the property makes sense, if the value's there, you can add substantial value in things, then yeah, obviously it's something you might want to consider. One quick thing here, and I think we're about done. Well, first off, so really quick on this. I mean, you can kind of sometimes give, I know you've done this with me, where I've given you like a map, and you can, without going out there, you can kind of give me a rough estimation of what you're seeing, right? So that's helpful in some cases to even decide if you want to progress with something, right? It's like, oh, what do you think looking at this? Obviously, you don't know until you actually go dig a hole or dig holes and do this boring and all of that. But you can, in some cases, get a rough estimation, at least, right, to help people know maybe what their next steps will be.
Correct. Yep. And we do that all the time, especially with our kind of development clients. That's always kind of the first thing they ask us is, hey, take a look at this property. We'll use the resource information I kind of laid out earlier in the discussion, LiDAR information and RCS soil survey. With that, we can kind of give an advisory opinion and say, hey, this property may have some potential, or yeah, we don't have any concerns, or hey, based on this information, you're probably looking at engineered pre-treatment. So we won't know for sure until we get on site and do our actual testing, but there is information we can kind of ascertain based on that preliminary resource review just at the computer level.
Yeah. And I mean, for example, that one you did near the beach for us, that was one where you weren't sure because it showed it. And like you said, it was only 100 feet difference. There's no way of knowing that until you're out there. But when you told me that before you went there, you said this could be one of these situations where, depending on where we are, it's either going to be nice and easy because the soils were decent. That one wasn't a soil issue. It was a water table issue. So it was like, or we're going to have to do X, and so, you knew it. It's just looking at it. But again, looking at these maps, it's like, there's no way of, 100 feet's nothing on these. So it's, but at least it gives you an idea of, do I want to hire somebody? Do I want to take the next step? What do I want? What are my thoughts based on where we're at, for everybody that's, an investor and looking at this. And then the only other thing is we'll put your information up, but you've mentioned a couple states, but I know like in North Carolina, I don't know if in South Carolina, you might work the whole state. I don't know. In North Carolina, I know you don't work the whole state. So if you want to, if people are thinking about this, if you just want to give a quick rundown of, obviously they can just reach out and ask you, but just a quick rundown of roughly where you work.
Yeah, definitely. So in South Carolina, we cover the entire state. So anywhere in South Carolina, we'll go do soil testing for permitting purposes. We do a lot: Charleston, Columbia, Florence, Rock Hill, Augusta, Greenville, you name it, we'll go. For North Carolina, we cover the entire southern half of the state. So basically, if you cut it, I guess, what is it, hamburger style, everything on the southern half of that line we would cover. So Charlotte, Marquette. We don't go quite as far north as Winston-Salem, but just under that. Same with Greensboro. We do a lot of work in Fayetteville, a lot of work on the southeastern half of the coastal plain, so Wilmington area primarily. So really that whole southern half of the state is really our primary focus in North Carolina.
Yeah. And if you're listening and you're wondering, just, pick up the phone or send an email and you'll get an answer very quickly as to whether or not it works. It's not exactly. no harm there. And the nice thing is, I think somebody else called you when you didn't work in that area, but you actually had a name and said, hey, you might want to check with so-and-so. So that's, obviously you guys are, know each other and things like that. And so you can give, recommendations accordingly. So we'll put this information up in here for everybody. So you can, if you have anything, he already showed it, but we'll actually include it in the post, so that if you have any, anything you want to reach out for or any work in those areas, if not, try to find, that's, I guess, the question. Is there a good resource? Like North Carolina has a great resource of soil scientists. Is that true in like every state? Do you know how that works? If somebody's looking for somebody?
Yeah, I don't know about every state. North Carolina, like you said, publishes a list of licensed individuals. South Carolina is the same situation through the licensing board. You just Google search soil scientist North Carolina or soil classifier South Carolina. Georgia, I believe, also has a list. But let me back up. Georgia has a list. Tennessee, Virginia, and I want to say Alabama also have lists of licensed professionals who can help with that. Again, those states, I'm not sure what the benefits would be using a licensed professional. They may differ based on the regulatory framework in those areas, but I do know those states in particular have lists of licensed people you can find online.
Okay. Yeah. And I mean, that's how I found you, honestly. I mean, I just pulled that up and sent out some information and you responded and, we ended up working together after that. So, I mean, that was pretty simple. I'm assuming there's got to be something out there. I mean, some way to find, I mean, so just searching or whatever. So,
yep.
All right. Well, we're very good. So, I mean, guys, a lot of this was a little higher level today. For a lot of you, it's not really higher level. I mean, it's higher level, but we don't do it. I mean, I'm literally like, I call him up and say, this is what I'm looking at. He kind of gives me the preliminary thing, an email or phone call back and forth. And then I decide whether or not I'm going to do it. And then he does it. And then he says, hey, we've got your paperwork or we've got your permit or whatever after we have the work done. So it's just something as you're growing in your investing business to decide. For years, we were basically, as investors, we were leaving deals on the table. We were like basically pushing them off, being like, oh, it doesn't perk, count doesn't perk, oh, we're done. And then we realized only a little while ago, we don't need to do that. There's other options out there, that from failure to 14 lots told us that, and honestly, it wasn't even a conversation with the soil scientist. It was a conversation with, it was very weird how this happened. Just a quick story. The one company started this project and it was actually it was supposed to be, they were supposed to they bought this big piece of property and they were going to do a bunch of lots. They got great soils on the N2 and then just kind of left it. It was nice and easy. They worked with the county or they worked with an engineering firm to create this. And so we just got in touch with that engineering firm that did those first 2 lots. And we just asked them, what's going on? Because this failed over here. And they're like, that's a bunch of nonsense. I mean, the engineers were just straight up told us, it was like, we can get more lots, guaranteed. They told us straight up, like, we have no questions. You will get more lots. They're like, we know the property. They had a soil scientist that didn't work for them directly, but they worked with all the time. So he did the work, sure enough. And we're like, wow, this turned from just a 17-acre whatever to 14 lots that substantially made. And then from there, we turned it into, well, as we're looking at some of these other deals, does it make sense? And, so far, and the first couple that Tyler's done for us, it's going to go from what would have been nothing, like lost deals, to walking away just a few years ago to, 6 figures in profits on those properties because of where they are. So huge potential, for those who are watching here and things like that, and people you want to have in your corner and people that you want to have working for you. So that's why we brought him on. And again, if you're, honest guy, I've worked with them. If you're in these areas, then reach out. If you're not in those areas, then find somebody, if it makes sense. That's all I can say, on that, just because of how it's just an extra nuance, it's not difficult. It's just, we talk all the time about working with the right people. And this is an example of that, where my involvement is literally a couple phone calls and emails, and that's it. And then obviously paying for the service, and that's it. And then somebody else, and we're adding this extra benefit in. So just something to keep in mind, everybody that's watching or listening there, as you're looking to take your business to, the next level. So that's all I got. Tyler, thank you so much for joining us. We'll put your information up. And if anybody has questions in those areas and wants to reach out, feel free. Obviously, if you have questions and you're watching this afterwards, feel free to comment, and we'll do our best to get responses to you. So again, thank you so much for joining us today.
Yeah, thanks, Jonathan. This was great. I really appreciate it.
All right. So have a great afternoon, and we'll catch everybody next week. See you later. Thanks.
Thanks.